Well, if the producers want me to dive into the avant-garde again, I can at least ogle the architecture for however long this video turns out to be. So what is futurism? And did it have more of an effect on the future of the 20th century that we call now than what they had hoped for? Let's find out after that title card.
The story will continue after this.
Futurism was a school of thought, as well as an architectural and aesthetical movement. Luckily for us, the style came about because of the philosophy. Even more luckily is that the movement is not related to the field of future studies that sometimes shares the same name. And that's a good thing too. That rationality video is still giving me nightmares. Futurist philosophy is that of, well, looking towards the future. It was some more utopian idea of forgetting the past and all its dirty nature in exchange for sleek and clean urban landscapes of fast cars and violent bouts. As for the aesthetical movement, it echoed such unabashed boldness as a breakaway from classical art. Italian futurism, or futurismo, developed in northern Italy as both a philosophical and artistic medium. The first futurists, people like Carlo Cara, Umberto Boccioni, Luigi Russolo, and the movement's founder, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, were all artists in one form or another. As boldly stated by Marinetti's manifesto, they were all young. Well, as young as nearly 30 can get you. The Italian school was created in this era of growing nationalism within the country since the beginning of the century. This underlying idea of the Italian state rising to cultural relevancy and economic power like the days of yore. The future was the only way to do so. As outlined in enough subsequent manifestos over the following years to put left-wing college students, mass shooters, and dear old Ted to shame, futurism was originally this philosophy that expanded into the fine arts. Starting with painting, but seizing the opportunity with music, film, and anything else viable for spreading word of an impending tomorrow, with works that captured the dynamicism of it all. The first instances of noise music would come from Russolo and his brother. Architecture can still be seen from the movement's machine age, and while many are lost to the annals of history, the medium of film became more accessible to artists in the late 1910s. They even had futurist dinner parties. Come 1914, the school would be split between Milan and Florence, causing tension between both groups. The Florentine school basically didn't like Marinetti and friends, while Milan would keep Marinetti at the helm and be the main source of a lot of futurist works after the war. Speaking of which, the dynamic era of Italian futurism would end after the first shots were fired in Sarajevo. But we'll touch on the war to hopefully end all wars in a minute. First, let's take a step back and into this nice troika. Across the mountains and valleys of the future European Union, on an estate outside the Ukrainian city of Kherson, a book club would form through three brothers in 1912. Inspired by the works of Marinetti and becoming the most influential group in Russian futurism, Hilea would be the first in line for this new future. Russian futurism, ego-futurism, cubo-futurism, and whatever followed suit from Odessa to Tomsk embraced these same Italian ideas but with a more anti-authority mindset. Where it differed from the Italians was in this idea of a futurist, self-sufficient world, adding in influences from the French Cubist art movement, as well as focusing on the literary and concrete rather than what philosophy was associated with Marinetti and his group. A lot of this is noted in the movement's own manifesto, which would try and live up to its name as a slap in the face to public taste, where the Russian counterparts would argue for this great leap forward from the pastoralism of the Obshinis and the authoritarian rule that saw it through. Their art focused more on this through classical mediums such as painting, literature, and some plays, with early Russian cinema being a hallmark for bringing forth the dawn of a new day. The Russian movement would align themselves with the communists under the understanding they both wanted the same revolt against the current regime. Leading up to the Bolshevik takeover of the empire, some futurists like Mayakovsky would help spur the public to action through agitprop arts, but the Russians would begin to fizzle out with a change in national management. The same could be partially seen in Italy, with the futurist-led Partito Politico Futurista being later incorporated into the ultra-popular fascist movement within the next decade. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's see how the war affected both of these groups. Italian futurism would change greatly on the advent of war, as they wanted Italy to join against the Austrians in that nationalistic fervor that helped birth the movement. Boccioni would die in an army camp in 1916, while others were overshadowed by French Cubism and the whole war thing. Overall, the Italian flavor of futurism would be weakened going into its second generation. The Russian futurist movement would shift towards its own end in the later years of the First World War. Vladimir would die on the front in 1917. The Tsar and the nation that sent him to his death would meet the same fate at the hands of a revolution. People like Mayakovsky would praise this revolution, albeit at the cost of too many lives in both the war and conflicts up to that moment. Sadly, even with some support from the Bolsheviks and other subclasses of communists, the Russian school began to slowly fade away, ending in the mid to late 1920s after death, obscurity, and a change in taste of its participants and patrons. Only Italy would remain as a home of the future. On a brief tangent, thanks to the rise of cinema, both schools of futurism had their own films. Now, while all but one of the entire movement's works are considered lost films, the Russian school did have a few names associated with them. People like Sergei Eisenstein and Lev Kuleshov. It's also noted in various sources that we would not have the majesty of German expressionist cinema without the futurists. So stuff like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, The Golem, and Nosferatu, plus the beauty of this Fritz Lang masterpiece you can see in the background right now, would all not be here without the work of futurist cinema. Futurism and cinema were meant for each other, both relatively young and new ideas, laced with this need for machinery and speed. Well, a love for speed outside how long it took to develop a film reel in the early 20th century. So tangent aside, let's get back to the whole post-World War thing and see what some dub the second wave of Italian futurism in action. Throughout the 1920s, during the rise to power of former soldier and director of socialist newspaper Avanti, Benito Mussolini, and his historically obscure and irrelevant political movement called fascismo, the speed and unabashedly nationalistic attitude of futurism's second generation would catch on with the black shirts. Not to mention that the Duce himself had read Marinetti when he was younger and saw the movement personally as the cultural catalyst to fascism's reign in Italy. The second generation of futurism would also see the utilization of the airplane for an amazing style of landscape painting called aerial pittura. Such works would incorporate the view from an airplane down onto a landscape in all its speed and technological marvel, and occasionally beat those hidden image AI memes by a century in having the world on canvas highlight a face. Over the course of the Mussolini dictatorship, futurism would fall into line with the more recent Novecento movement that would later overshadow them, alongside the nationalistic love of reanimating dead empires. As another note, Mussolini's fascist manifesto was written in part by Marinetti alongside Italian syndicalist Alceste de Ambri. The futurists of Italy would continue their work in one form or another, with the 1920s and 30s proving more acceptable when the most influential power of the nation says their art was of national importance. The movement would also be divided between a broad mix of anti-fascists and people of the same mindset of Marinetti, with this divide existing through the rest of the movement's existence. Touching back briefly with the Russians, and, well, a lot of other people during the 20s and 30s, the ideas preceded by terms cubo, ego, or just that classic futurism without adjectives, would have their ups and downs under the Bolshevik state. The Bolsheviks liked the artists for what all they did to help bring about their brand of communism, but Soviet authorities started to dislike such creative types a few years after the Civil War. So with the deaths of Mayakovsky and Khlebnikov among others, Russian futurism would become part of the past it sought to quickly escape. Futurism, the Italian one, would begin to decline around the rising tension that marked the Second World War. The Italian state began to turn on a movement that had once triumphed, posing the nationalistic and industrial school as just another form of degenerate art. This inadvertently did work in accordance with Marinetti's manifesto. Futurism, like any avant-garde movement, was to die out as quickly as it began. A few others claimed the death was quicker, dying when that futurist promise of war happened to Italy in 1915. Other academics would point to the death of Marinetti himself in 1944 to a relic of a heart as the true death of futurism. but it would live on in one way or another outside the Italian and Russian countrysides. Movements like France's Art Deco, the precursor to a lot of postmodern art known as Surrealism, and my favorite early Soviet art movement known as Constructivism would follow closely after the initial arrival and departure of the Futurists. The Soviet Union would embrace a few ideas of the movement due to its forward-centric way of thinking, this birthing a lot of arts movements within the early Union, as those in the original movement were long separated from cultural relevancy under the new regime. Aside from the false promises of the Futurists being welcomed in the realms of Mussolini and Hitler, their stuff would be thrown under the label of degenerate art in favor of more classical works throughout the twilight years of the movement. It would be in this wake of this slow disillusion of the idea of a future that new ways would come about in one form or another. But that's a story for another time, as we have spent nearly half the episode just talking about the history of the artistic movement. The Googie architecture movement from the mid-century would also take from Futurism, with everything being situated around the fast cars and new technologies of the time. Later down the line, both the neo-futurist movement and cyberpunk genre of the late 20th century would be greatly influenced by their Italian predecessors, each adapting the ideologies of speed, youth, and violence through either a utopian lens or as blatant criticism. With neo-futurism, it's obvious why it came about, with the same hope for speed and sleek buildings to bring about the designs of a future dreamt up nearly a century prior. Cyberpunk, on the other hand, is noted more as a critical reaction to this chasing of utopia through the means of speed and progress, regardless of cost. Within both, there's still that same idea of moving ever forward, rejecting the natural world of the past for the sleek and modern. Those ideas, and rampant consumerism, did fuel the 50s and 80s after all. Now, with learning that both my beloved Raygun Gothic and Cyberpunk came about thanks to proto-fascists and unaligned Bolsheviks, I may forever be in the debt of these politically extreme artists. But who exactly were they? The Italian Futurists, the proverbial Roman Empire of Futurism, birthed such an idea at the hands of people like Marinetti, Severini, and Boccioni. The Italians were more a well-rounded school, encompassing nearly every artistic medium possible. Age-wise, as Marinetti pointed out in the first manifesto, many of the founding members were as young as a late 20 to early 30-something can be considered, being born at least a decade after the unification of Italy. The first wave of Futurismo would be rode by more recognizable names that were mentioned in our history bit, with many of the Florentine group leaving around the First World War, only to be replaced by a second wave of futurists such as Mazzioni, Filia, and Monacelsi over the course of the next 2 decades. The Italians were highly nationalistic, coming from an age where the Italian state was still a relatively new actor in the theaters of Europe and the world. Such ideation of nationalism in their works would encase itself as this dogma around the Milan school. The Russians, ironically founded primarily by free Ukrainians, while being built up by art scenes the empire over, were a cohort of creative types who rivaled the Italians in so many places that they added prefixes to distance themselves from Marinetti and his fascistic undertones. People like the Berliot brothers, Mayakovsky, and even the great Boris Pasternak were among many of the artists who would wear the moniker of futurist outside of that boot-shaped peninsula. The Russians also increased the appeal of futurist art to the world, with a merging of cubism among other styles to wash off the association of those nationalist Italians and create a future for the common man, even if it did scare some rural proletariat. I now see why they loved the same ideals that brought about the Bolsheviks. Both were anarchic in their own ways, with the futurists seeking more to break from the shackles of Tsardom and bring in a new world of tomorrow, compared to the Bolshevik and other communist leanings of a proletariat utopia. But more on that in a minute or two, because there were others who would be considered futurist outside these two countries, with artistic types across the European continent and Western world sporting the moniker. While not really mentioned anywhere in this video outside the segment, these non-Italian, non-Russians would take the ideas of the movement to new theaters. So now that we have all but one journalistic question asked, we only have to know why. Taking a bit of a different route for questioning, we have 2 why-they-do-that's for these futurist friends of ours. Firstly is the core. Why exactly did futurism come about, and what was its appeal? And secondly, why was it more prevalent in Italian and Russian cultures? Well, if we look at the manifestos from Milan to Moscow, we can see that futurism came about because it wanted to embrace the only thing we all get to experience: the future.
Noi siamo l'ultima visione dei secoli, perché mai dovremmo guardare al passato quando vogliamo distruggere il mistero dell'impossibile. Il tempo e lo spazio sono morti. Ieri!
The birth of Italian futurism is a product of an Italy late to massive industrialization seen during a gilded Belle Époque.
Per troppo tempo l'Italia è stata un commerciante di roba usata. Con questo vogliamo dire che è ora di liberarla dagli innumerevoli musei che ci assillano, come tombe.
In politics and art, Italian futurism and fascism, cultural sociologist Anne Bowler notes that such goals of futurism were in one way to reignite an Italian powerhouse for the adoption of all the new things for a return to the glory days, just with a lot better technology. Futurism would be against the past up until its slow integration into the fascist political movement and its love for all things passatismo. There was also this utopian idea seen within the romanticism of fascistic futurism, what could also be labeled as futurist nationalism, wherein the ideas of futurism were that meant for the people and the nation-state, for embracing the unabashedly chauvinist mentality seen in second-generation futurism. The nation-state could be that of pure and masculine superiority, along with this baseline that the nationalism of futurism itself was that of one nation above all others, in leading a brutal and cutting-edge charge of the Light Brigade into the theater of a fastly evolving world. This utopian appeal of futurism is the first in a long line of what would evolve into the cool neo-futurist cityscapes and technological leaps we see in both reality and speculation today. It was this search for what could be seen through avant-garde eyes and made reality in the same hands to reject the past for a better future that could live up to or even overshadow the grandeur of the ancients. Italian futurism came about from this love of advancing ever forward through speed and violence, only for a few of its own ideals to end up altering the movement's course. The Russian school came about more as an answer to the Italian one. Marinetti's manifesto was received in Russia. To what degree depends on the year, and served as a catalyst for the slap in the face of public taste that made the Russians different. The man himself and the Italian school were disliked in the nation for political and practical reasons, with their answer to futurism being an unabashedly forward movement against Pushkin, Tolstoy, and Marinetti himself. Ironic to their hatred, a lot of this attitude comes from Marinetti's 1909 manifesto, which said to dispose of the ways of old, the museums, academics, and the slow horse-drawn troikas, in favor of the new, tall buildings, bellowing factories, and the pure speed of early automobiles. As to why we only see these movements in two states prone to totalitarian takeover, and not France, Japan, or whatever was happening in a Brazil without Pedro, it's more a case of context and mentality. In Italy, the movement is seen historically as a nationalistic byproduct, brought upon by the ignition of love for the Italian nation-state, and later its predecessors, carried by the youthful spirit of revolution that is seen in basically every young artistic and social movement possible. 2003's The Struggle for Modernity, Nationalism, Futurism, and Fascism cites some earlier academic papers in calling the futurist movement an empty fiction created by romantic decadence and masked by a professed love for modern reality. One where they were performing more to reanimate the corpse of the last great Italian state from a millennia ago, through promises of a better future they could dream up on canvas and paper. In Russia, the more anti-authority tones, coupled with historical policies seen since the implementation of the Romanov state, aided the movement in being this beacon of throwing off despotism. Their alliance with the communists, and later Bolsheviks, would come about mainly from that shared goal of questioning and changing authority. To the futurists of Moscow and St. Petersburg, their future was different from the Italians. They saw futurist art as more of a medium to express the hopes and ideas of particular groups, such as Halea and the ego-futurists, against the tide of tyranny up until a change in taste of that public face. As noted in an introduction to a 2005 book, Russian futurism can be divided at the revolution, with anything before being that anarchistic beacon, and what all that came after, trying and failing to survive into the Comintern. The Russians were also inspired by more paganistic leanings, with primitivist ideas seen throughout many of the writings of the earlier movement, and slight ideations towards early science fiction. So only now do I realize that we should have done what we did with unilateralism and made 2 separate videos for the 2 separate schools, rather than trying to crunch both into the 20-something minutes we have given a lot of our episodes. But that's a problem for the future. There were other schools and movements across the globe inspired by such ideas, but they would not be comparatively as politically impactful as the art of a fascist regime or the makers of communist propaganda. Looking at the Italians and Russians for the added context of a lot of this video, as well as a general idea for the feel of the culture at the time, we can see that the futurist movement was avant-garde and rebellious of reason to be so. But as fate likes to play a few hands the wrong way, both movements that champion freedom in countless forms would be used as mouthpieces for totalitarian ideas. Futurism as this totalitarian tool is an ironic one through a postmodern lens. Perceived anarchists and shakers of the status quo quietly incorporating themselves into a state-run art project where they are now the ones in power, and thus the status quo, for however long the state lets them exist, which ranged from a few years to a decade until tastes changed. Now, if it wasn't already mentioned in the greater historical record, Italian futurism loved fascism and was embraced for a few years by Benito Mussolini in his human rights violating attempt at a Roman Empire. Unsurprisingly, a movement that has
Cioifichiamo la guerra, l'unica forma di igiene, il militarismo, il patriottismo, la forza distruttiva dei lavoratori.
In their manifesto would be accepted in one way or another by the Duce, with one great exception in pinning fascismo as a futurist movement being that they did not like the idea of removing Italian cultural history. Outside of the futurist nationalism of the second generation, the Italian state saw the movement as some artist who could champion a new state-run future of Italy under a revived Roman Republic and be disposed of. But I should note that futurism was enamored with fascism, not some tool of it, like a very brief overview would have you believe. So it would be through this mutual and temporary love that futurism would be one of the mediums pushed by the Mussolini government, aside from his mistress's preferred group, Novecento Italiano, which would dominate the futurists in terms of propaganda usage. Russian futurism, on the other hand, was of great interest towards the Bolsheviks in their core ideas alone. A mutual love sparked briefly amongst the infighting of the Civil War, to strip away the past in favor of progress and urbanization, allowing for the future to finally come to a nation stuck in the 16th century. The Russian movement would be co-opted by the winning Bolsheviks until their own demise as an anarchistic movement in the mid-20s. You can see how they fell out of style under the authoritarians of a new regime that sought uniformity under a boss not so different from the old one. There is this criticism of futurism betraying itself through going back on what all was said in the manifestos. As pointed out in 2010 and mentioned in other sources since the end of the movement, Marinetti changed futurism to fit into the fascist state, taking the avant-garde and locking it within chains of an authoritarian ideal, shifting these ideas of the movement to be more of that with the times, while still holding some banner of being against what all was commodity culture and the boring slowness of things. Futurism was supposed to fade away within a decade, to be superseded by the next best and youngest thing, only to continue under the new regime, something ensured by Marinetti so that the avant-garde did not go the way of anyone perceived as politically left of the party, for that was the future now. A utopia run by an authoritarian regime for the rest of eternity. An eternity that, in all reality, ended in 1944. Much like Marinetti, futurism was supposed to die. That was the art of it, but it was left on life support for longer than even the worst coma cases. Futurism did not die in a fast and violent manner like they wrote back in the early 1910s. Rather, it fell to a slow death in the near mainstream until obscurity finished it off in the years around World War II, condemning it to the dustbin of history as yet another artistic project that said so much and only did so much to create a lasting shadow that would not be forgotten like many groups of yore. Even more interestingly, as a bit of a tangent, a 1990 paper would note that Italian futurism ignores death, a sort of Uno reverse card for the idea that futurism should die out and be replaced, as well as an influencing point for fascism. Of course, While I could be as poetic as ever and say that futurism would not influence more than just slight avant-gardes for the rest of the century, the brutalist hellscape of Khrushchevki and Brezhnevki that make up where I lived in suburban Riga would disprove of that. So futurism as an idea held on for the 20th century in one way or another. With that out of the way, the futurists, the pioneers for a new age of humanity.
È dall'Italia che noi lanciamo questo violento, scioccante manifesto.
From the factories and studios of the Piedmont to those wide-open plains of the Dnieper and Volga, they pushed for new frontiers in whatever form they could, only to be held back and killed by the same totalitarian ideas that once brought them more prominence.
Пойдем, поэт, царит, поем, умира